Hey everybody, it's Joey from Roadmap. Hello. If you could just type in the chat box so I know that you can see me, that would be divine. And if you could hear me too, that's also important. Cool. Hey, awesome. Cool. Great. So welcome to week. I know there was a little bit of a break, so now we're doing 2 hours back to back. So excited for that. So let me bring Jenna into the mix. Oh, I feel like a DJ. Let me bring Jenna into the mix. Okay, I'm insane, but that's okay. Hey, Jenna, can you see and hear me? Hello. Oh my God, did you ever see the trailer for Unwanted? No, not Unwanted. That's my love life. Unfriended. You also see it because whenever I do a Zoom and somebody's box pops up and I can't see them right away, I always think of that that trailer. It's so creepy. Hey, Jenna.
Hello. Thanks, DJ.
How are you feeling?
So much better now. Yeah, sorry about last week. I quite literally got corona while flying home
Oh,
to
wow.
Ohio. So luckily I had a semi-mild case, but last weekend was rough for
Yeah, I
me.
can't even imagine. Are you still in Ohio?
Yeah, I'm in Ohio for like a month and a half just because with
What?
quarantining and everything. I
Yeah,
thought I was gonna have to do the 2-week quarantine, but now either way it's like you have to make it worth it when you have to spend 14 days isolated,
seriously, yeah.
on
Yeah.
top of like being a carrier or whatever. I'm a marked one now.
I know it's so crazy. I'm afraid to go into the store and just like cough every like just a little bit because I feel like everybody's gonna be like, get him. But
Yeah,
super,
it's so weird. For me, it hasn't even been the coughing. It's like been this like low grade consistent hangover, which is almost, no, I'm not going to say it's more annoying. That's
well,
just
you are
ignorant.
drinking every
But
night, so that's part of it. I mean, you
well,
are
there
drunk
is
every night.
my alcoholism. So
What's your colleague's name?
Nick Wingate. Yeah.
Nick.
Is he
Yep, there he is. Oh my
okay?
God, do you remember Nickelodeon? Of course. I said
Yes.
Nick, and I was like, oh my God, all my memories.
Nickelodeon. You're literally a radio DJ right
I'm
now.
literally a radio DJ. Yeah, for sure. Okay, let me get Nick.
Great.
So I'll have him.
Hey guys,
Amazing.
Hey, how are
Very
you?
nice.
I'm good.
Beautiful background.
I know. I'm like, is that LA? No.
I made that joke before as
Like
well.
almost.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, somebody already said that joke? Oh, I thought it was witty.
No.
All right.
And to
Way to
go off
bring him
your
down.
Nickelodeon, yeah, my bar mitzvah theme was actually Nick at Night, so it was pretty
I
lit.
love that.
Oh, wow. I always felt so scandalous watching Nick at Night. I was like, oh, look at me. My parents don't even know.
Well, you were because it was Bill Cosby, so
Yeah, that is true. It all comes
little
full
did we
circle.
know
Your dad of the
then.
Golden Girls.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well,
much
cool. Well,
pure.
I'll let you two take over. I'll be in the wings
Mhm.
when it's time
Great.
for Q&A. So everybody listening, there's a Q&A box and a chat box. If you have any questions, put it in the Q&A box. I would wait just like maybe like 15, 20 minutes before typing in questions, just in case I go over something that you were going to ask anyway. But just wait about 15 minutes and then you can start typing in questions. And other than that, oh, he has the Blumhouse shirt all ready to
I
go.
know. I saw that.
I have like 20 of them, so it's like now makes up like half of my closet, and
It's the quarantine
it
look.
felt apropos.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, then I'll let you two take over, and I'll be listening.
Amazing. So I figured this week would be a good week to kind of go over physical production and what that might look like in a post-corona world. I know most of you guys are aspiring writers, but ultimately the goal is to get those things made into TV and film. So we'll be talking a little bit today about what that might look like. And since Nick is a coordinator in physical production at Blumhouse Television, and I can speak a little bit on behalf of the features division, which, low budget world, but I will put out the disclaimer that, Nick has, I'm sure, been getting so many questions since you're in physical production for what production is going to look like, and this is constantly evolving. So while he's very read up on things, who knows what that will ultimately look like. I just know he's been involved in the conversations over the past couple months. So if you want to just talk a little bit about, what might that look like in the new normal. I figured we'd start off from the ground up. We've talked already about, we've briefly gone over, what that will look like in screenplay stage. And a lot of these things, coincide with writing just a contained script anyways, but there are the updated things to keep in mind, which are like, intimacy on set and limited characters, not having older characters, more outdoor scenes are more attractive. You want to talk a little bit about like what those conversations have looked like?
Sure. Yeah. I'll go ahead and just kind of introduce myself a little bit further. I'm a production coordinator at Blumhouse Television. So I work directly under the head of physical production, but I also work in tandem with the head of post-production. And then I also do a little bit of work with the business affairs and production legal departments. And basically my last like 2.5, 3 months, what I've been doing every day is kind of going through the different procedures and protocols that the different respective unions in the industry have put out about what they expect to happen on a film set. Each studio and production company is putting out their own set of protocols that they want to see how a film set is going to be run, and basically also what the local state governments want from the productions in order to start issuing permits again. So things have been changing every week. Things have changed a lot just over the last week or so with, there's obviously been a surge of cases across the country. So that's also changed the conversations, but mostly today, I want to talk about how exactly a film set might look different, probably for the next at least year or so. And also as creatives, what you guys should be prepping for in terms of how you want to go about either writing material in the next year or trying to make material that you can shoot in your next year, because it's going to obviously be a challenge and not impossible, but you should know what studios and production companies, how they're viewing material and what is appealing to them that can be made easily with the protocols in place for the next year or so.
Totally, and especially because there really isn't a time cap on this, like who knows if it will be a year. So I think unfortunately these are all things that are restrictive, but also can a lot of times, like I know being at Blumhouse, I've seen these type of restrictions like really breed creativity that I've like been so honored to witness. Like it is really cool to see how people can thrive under crazy restrictive measures. So while things are frustrating, do not give up hope because you never know what you're capable of. Like some of the best stories might be broken, who knows? So I guess we can first start with things that are certain, because we have so much that is not certain right now. So from what I've gleaned, like it seems like crews being broken down to strictly what's essential, similar to like when you have nudity on set, going bare bones, and by proxy meaning things will get a lot slower.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's two things that are going to be certain about production for the foreseeable future, in that it's going to be smaller, it's going to take longer, and it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah.
Those are the three things that we can count on. You want to minimize the amount of people who are on set, obviously, so you can enforce um, social distancing. You can actually make that happen on set. And with that in mind, things are going to slow down, not only because there's less crew members on set, but what a lot of unions and studios and a lot of these procedural documents that have been put out have proposed is for film sets to basically be broken down into the pod system. And the pod system was something that was first used in Italy when the virus broke out. Not just for film sets, but just for factory workers, where you are basically assigned a pod, and you only work with those people. You don't interact with anybody else at the factory, only the people who are in your pod. Basically, if someone gets sick in your pod, you guys all get sent home
Which brings me to the question of, like, if we can hope that testing will be more advanced by the time people are shooting, which is quickly approaching. But let's hope that testing can get better in the United States, and we can get faster responses. But like, say, there are people on sets that are so essential that if they come down with something, the whole production screeches to a halt.
Yeah.
Is there any thoughts around that?
Well, I can touch on that in a second, but just going back to kind of the pod system, basically all of your departments are going to be, for the most part, separated. And how a film set has worked, as we've known it, is, you maximize your time by having every department working at the same time. You're trying to rush before you get this shot off, and cameras working, Grip It Electric is working, you have makeup and hair doing last looks in there, sounds there. That's not going to be able to work like that. Your art department's going to have to come in by itself, prep the scene, leave. You're going to have to bring in Grip It Electric. They're going to do their thing and leave. So it's going to, the time it takes to set up each setup is going to be a lot longer. And there's probably going to be some creative issues too, because, it's not like the director is seeing everything being put together at one time. It's kind of like seeing everything being put together piece by piece. So, in terms of, prepping for what happens if a pod goes down, what a lot of productions are doing are, you're going to have to come up with your A crew and your B crew, which means for every position, you're going to want to find an alternative or a backup if someone gets sick, which is really
That's
tough.
what I was wondering about.
Yeah. So a lot of productions are even budgeting extra crew because it's inevitable that someone's going to probably, depending on how many people and where you're shooting, that someone's probably going, to get sick. And a whole pod might have to go down, like a whole.
So like there'll be a benched pod.
Basically, you want to have a whole roster. I mean, you want to have a whole roster of people for every position that can be switched interchangeably if someone gets sick. Also, keep in mind, like, there's also things to keep in mind, to think about where, people have, if a DP has kids going back to school in the fall, and the school for some reason shuts down because there's an outbreak there, he might not be able to come to work anymore because there's no childcare. And so you have to prep for a variety of different situations for substituting your crew out, not just for them getting sick, but for a whole variety of different reasons.
Right. And that's what's been interesting to me, because I think, physical production in sets have been always kind of ethically questionable, I would say. And I think, like a lot of other things with Corona, a spotlight is kind of being shined down, and those holes are the cracks are showing, to
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
So, things that I've heard talked about are like, will productions have to like give a stipend for health insurance, and like, will with the shorter hours, and I know this is jumping ahead because we'll get to the whole French hours thing, but like, just to keep in mind, like, an ethical perspective, it's like, well, if there are shorter hours, how do you make up for the overtime that people are getting and banking home with?
Yeah.
It's so many questions that people are considering where it was never a question before.
Yeah, and there's a lot of production companies who are considering making showing that you have proof of health insurance as a prerequisite or a requirement for employment.
Really?
Some states already require. In California, you have to have health insurance. So some states already have that set in place. But yeah, that's also another thing that people have to figure out. A lot of studios, I can't speak for Blumhouse specifically, but there's this, they want to know when they hire somebody if they've had COVID, and there's certain legal issues as to whether or not you can actually ask a crew member if they can share their personal health information. They want to know if you've had it, if anybody else in your family has had it. So it's a very,
because then you have the antibodies, so then you're
yeah,
not getting it again. So I'm like
it's a
prime
slippery slope.
hireability right now. Antibodies are all up in my system.
Yeah, well, hopefully. But you touched on French hours, and that's definitely something that we're probably going to see implemented in most productions, both film and TV, where basically the standard for a shoot day has been 12 hours.
And then oftentimes like into 14, sometimes
Yeah.
16.
Which is crazy, and it's brutal. But it is also where a lot of people make their money, is in that overtime, and basically what
and where everyone's immune system gets depleted.
Yeah, and so in an effort to, you're going to have smaller crews, and like I said, with everything broken down into pods, you're going to be shooting less scenes a day or less pages a day. And you're going to want to not go over the 10 hours and into overtime. One, because people can't afford it right now. Two, because people are going to get tired and they're going to stop. We need people to be sharp and following the procedures that are in line and the protocols in place, like social distancing, like wiping everything down. There's going to be, a PA team that is on most sets that is dedicated to literally just sanitizing stuff on set.
Oh God.
So you don't want to be working long hours in the day where people are going to be getting tired and they're going to not be following these protocols. So it's very likely that we're going to be having 10-hour shoot days where they call them French hours, where you basically shoot consecutively for 8 to 10 hours, but you don't break for lunch. You basically just have food available for the crew where they can eat at any point during the day. And you're also doing that because, sorry, go ahead, Jenna.
I was just going to say, which from a creative standpoint, like I feel like I hear a lot of filmmakers talk about how they prefer French hours because you're just going with the momentum, and like when you break, the momentum is broken up, like the creativity behind the scenes and the mojo, for lack of a better term, really doesn't get interrupted that way. The big con is for the people that are working on their feet and don't get that break.
Yeah.
So it's there's pros and cons to it. And like, I mean, to me, it's so ideal because so much of shooting is like, you're just accepting that you're not going to have a life for 3 months or 2 months or however long the shoot is. So like, that's another area where like Corona has shined that spotlight down and been like, maybe people do want a life, and maybe people don't want their immune system completely depleted from working 16 hours a day.
Well, and again, the access to childcare is an issue. When people work 12 hours a day, sometimes 14 hours a day, and they have kids, that's was really tough even before the pandemic. Now it's going to be even more difficult. So,
Right.
lowering those hours down might be helping in that regard as well. It also, I mean, the not breaking for lunch is also, lunch itself is a really big issue on a film set now, because these kind of big catered lunches that Hollywood has kind of been getting used to.
I like shiver at it now.
Open buffet style lunches, that's not going to be the case. Everything's going to have to be individually wrapped and prepared, and people are going to have to eat in cycles. You can't just have everybody out in one tent breaking for lunch at one given time. So the French hours actually helps with that a little bit as well. The impact of doing this, of having shorter days, just means longer days. I mean, just like the actual total amount of days. Features that were shot in 3 weeks might take them 5 weeks now. Television episodes that are shot anywhere between 8 and 12, sometimes 15 days of shooting. They might be they might be closer to 20.
Yeah, I heard it's around, like, so far it's looking like 20% as added on to the back, where it's like typical page count is around 5, and now it's for low budget when you're like steamrolling ahead.
It's probably going to go down to like 3.5. But I mean, that's all speculatory, because no one. The problem is everyone's guessing that what's going to happen. There's been very few people who have been able to shoot during this time. Most of it has been overseas, and the stuff that's been shot inside the U.S. Has been mostly like documentary style filmmaking.
And Tyler Perry's whole system, where he was like, everyone come stay on the lot for 2 weeks prior.
So Tyler Perry had a very special set of circumstances where he owns a ridiculously large set of land in Atlanta, where his own studios. He has his own housing there, because he actually, during certain portions of the year, he actually houses a lot of homeless people and a lot of like youth, which is really cool that he does that. But there's a lot of accommodation that was on set. Basically, he housed an entire film crew, all the actors, everybody lived at this studio for like 2.5 weeks, and was continuing shooting some of his productions. People were getting tested every day. Nobody was allowed out. All food was made on site. All laundry was done on site. Eventually, SAG did shut it down because actors were having issues with basically not being able to leave this bubble. And there were a couple of things not necessarily thought out. But this idea of a camp quarantine where an entire film set lives together at one location for the variety of filming was something that people were really looking at doing at the beginning of the pandemic. Now,
so many ethical concerns.
Not so much. People aren't really considering it because, one, it's very expensive to accommodate an entire film crew and all of its actors on one location. It's virtually impossible for a low budget or indie film to do it. And two, it's hard to, even when you have everybody contained, there's not really a way of making sure that people are staying within that bubble. It just leads to a variety of different issues, both from a financial standpoint and from a logistical and social standpoint as well.
Which I imagine could like do really interesting things for the actual like translation to screen, because there's probably a chemistry on set that like would not be there if they weren't housing together. But I mean, it's like, there has to be a lot of money in that to be like, come risk your life and give up your entire life
Yeah,
this
and be
amount
away
of
from
time.
be away from your family for however long the shoot is, and get there. Think about actors would also have to get there 2 weeks ahead of time so they can self-isolate. Then they're going to have to be away from their family for the duration of the shoot, and then they're also going to have to self-isolate for another 2 weeks coming out of shooting as well.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, like, the talent is the most vulnerable at this point because, like, there's no, I don't imagine there's VFXing out masks from talent. So, like,
Probably not.
yeah,
I'm
you
sure
can
someone
only
will try.
wish. Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I'm sure, but like, so that's where people are considering things like, I know you were talking about like split screen and looking at these scenes where there may be conversations happening, like can we break this conversation apart too?
Yeah. Well, we can move over to creative substitutions, which I think is probably going to be the most applicable information for many of the people in here. And that's basically the writers and directors and creatives in general should be prepared to, you know, really look at the material that they've either already written or material or analyze material that they're about to go write, and analyze for creative substitutions they can make in order to make their story more realistic to shoot during like under these protocols and under these circumstances. um, the two types of scenes that are going to be virtually impossible to shoot over the next year are, fight and action scenes, um, and intimate scenes, scenes that require a lot of physical intimacy, like sex scenes, or anything like that. Um, those types of scenes are the ones that are basically you're gonna have to find ways to like really get around. You're with action scenes, we're basically gonna have to be restricted to just like gunfights or long distance kind of combat. Any type of like hand-to-hand combat is probably not going to work because it takes a lot of not only like coordination from a regular film set where you have to have stunt coordinators and you have to have stunt doubles. There's a lot of close contact between everybody. The camera has to get sometimes really close to the actors. That's just not really going to be possible. It's impossible to kind of social distance and do those types of scenes. So if you have stories that revolve around, if you're writing an action movie, you might really want to reevaluate the type of combat that is in your story and how much there is. And if you really think it's necessary, think about the types of ways that you can get around it. Like, can you shoot a fight scene that's mostly through like, can you just shoot it where it's mostly just shadows, where you can fake how close the
Yeah.
actors are together?
And that's where it's like fun to think.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not great that there are these restrictions, but it is fun to like work within those limitations. And I'm excited to see what people can come up with. And that's where if you can work those things in, people are going to love your script probably because everyone's looking for that, where they don't have to make those changes and wait for rewrites and things like that.
Yeah, and same thing with sex scenes. Like, how can you allude to a sex scene, or how can you illustrate that kind of intimacy without actually seeing it? You're just going to have to people are going to have to get really creative. How can you rely on sound? Obviously, our creative team for all the projects that we currently have on our slate are asking every writer to really, think about whether or not the story could be translated to animation. I mean, animation is about to completely boom within the next year or so. And I think you'll probably see a lot of animated stories, a lot of stories in the animated field that weren't necessarily there before. A lot of, you might see a lot of animated adult dramas within the next year or so. And you know, there is a lot of creativity there as well. You know, I don't know if you saw the show that was done. I think it was called Undone on Amazon.
I've been really wanting to watch that because it
Yeah,
looks great.
and you know, there's also ways to. It might seem a little bit hokey, but also ways of blending live action and animation. Can you, if you do have a fight scene, is there a way to creatively transition out of live action into an animated sequence for a fight scene? Obviously, that does sound a little bit
Yeah.
hokey from the get-go, but these are the types of things.
When it's
that you have to
done
think.
well, though, when it's done with everything, when it's done well, it's really cool to see because it's not done often. So
Mhm.
it will be interesting to see what comes out of this in terms of like different styles of filmmaking.
Yeah, and then, you know, just really analyzing every scene one by one, thinking about, okay, what can I strip away from this to make it more friendly? You know, if a character is just having a walk and talk conversation with their friend, can this be done over the phone? Like, can this just
Or outside.
or outside? Well,
Outside is a huge thing.
like, can you have two actors just being separated and, you know, doing this conversation over the phone? And then, which leads you, okay, how can I make this still visually interesting? You know, we were talking the other day about, I was using the example of Mean Girls when they're
Stunning
doing,
reference.
you know, the scene where they're on the phone, a bunch of them, and it's cutting from different split screen when people are jumping off and on the call. So that's a great example of like of a substitution you can use to make it a little bit friendlier. You know, other examples are ways to, you know, when you're thinking about a scene, people who are writer directors who are writing scenes also in a way of thinking about how they can shoot them. You know, you're going to want to write scenes that you know that you could shoot with a minimal amount of coverage. You know, the days of being able to being able to shoot a scene from every angle, from getting a wide shot to getting, you know, close-ups, you know, shot like medium close-ups, it's just not really going to be plausible. So, you know, can I write this scene in a way that could be shot with just one master shot?
Or getting creative with like a master shot and like the shadows or something like that, like you were talking about, where it's like, do we have to actually see the talent on camera?
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. And then, you know, there's other considerations to have as well. You know, with certain above the line, you know, things to consider as well. Like, probably not the best time to be writing or shooting a script where the main character is an elderly woman, because it's going to be very hard. You're going to be putting a lot of pressure on a production.
Or young children.
Or young children. You don't want to have those types of main characters right now because
they're just
those people are
cesspools.
putting themselves, it's too much to have those people put themselves at risk during an entire production, right? So those are other things to kind of consider as well. You know, actors that have other skills in, you know, in terms of it's going to be really useful for actors that know how to do their own makeup really well.
I was going to say that's something I did not think about. And it's like, I feel like you're suddenly going to see it where people that were formerly on set treated like gods, now it's going to be like, how many hats can each person wear? And can you do all these different things? Which is interesting to me because the delegation of work was so streamlined prior to this.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's not going to be a lot of last looks that go on where, you know, where somebody comes on at the very last second. I was going to say, like, where, you know, you have your makeup and your hair team coming in, making, you know, these perfect changes to the actors at the very last minutes. They look great on camera. That's just not, they're not going to have the time, and you're not going to be able to socially distance when you're doing that. So, you know, having actors that have the ability to do their own last looks is going to be super helpful. So that's another thing to just kind of consider.
And then
I do want to flag. Someone did mention that yes, the largest group getting infected right now is 20 to 40, which is true, but from a purely, from a liability standpoint, and in terms of, production companies and studios are always thinking about the worst case possible. And that's not to say that if somebody in their 20s or 40s gets infected, that they can't have some serious health problems. Obviously, that's been proven that can't be the case. But from a, when you're going to an insurance broker trying to get insurance for your production, and you say that your main lead is a 75-year-old woman, the premium on your insurance for your production is going to be ridiculously high. You may not even get insurance for that, because it's so
Right.
it's that much more likely that that person could get sick and be out of commission for a foreseeable future.
I was going to add to that too. Yeah, just to say, because I saw the antibody thing too. It's like, again, disclaimer that we're just talking about things that we've been hearing and like things that are discussed within the industry. By no means are these set guidelines. All of these things are evolving almost day by day, it seems like. But again, like these are things to think about and keep in mind. We don't know what's going to happen with testing and the vaccine. Like it really could change in next week, who knows. So this is just like, what we've been seeing up until this point. Yeah, so I think, so we went over a lot of like the risk factors. It really does all come down to risk, is like you said, like at any time going into shooting something, it is, I know we've talked about this in other classes, but it's about minimizing the risk, because you don't know if your movie's going to make any money, especially with low budget films. Like when you have tentpole films in, Fast and Furious, it's going to make money, but like these are films where it is a huge risk already. And so now that risk has been, expanded to levels that we didn't even know previously were possible. These are all guidelines that will at least help in minimizing that. Still, it's been said that like insurance is likely still not going to cover Corona related production problems. So, these, because insurance is not covering, that's why these extremely restrictive guidelines are necessary.
Yeah, and then it just further going off of that, a lot of places you're not going to be able to get a filming permit without having certain types of insurance for your production, and you're not going to be able to get insurance on your production unless you have a story or have a type of production that can be done realistically with what they want.
And they're going to be so nitpicky, just from experience already working with insurance companies on production. It's like I can't imagine what it would take for insurance to like so willingly cover a production right now,
Mm-hmm.
That's why
they're going to need to see productions out there shooting and it not be
making it work,
not it be like, see that it can work and not being like a disaster, and then hopefully things can get a little bit easier from there.
Which I think is, I've heard a buzz around that, like that's going to result in a lot of people fighting over this lot space to shoot on because it is going to be so essential to shoot on a lot now.
Oh yeah. A lot of that's another big thing about just locations in general. Obviously, like you touched on, shooting outside is a lot more preferable than shooting in a contained space. And if you do have a contained space, the the permitting offices are probably going to require a lot of information on the particular location as it relates to the dimensions. Is there enough area for you to social distance in there? Is there rooms where you can that are large enough to isolate different pods from people, like from different pods? Is there space to house and sanitize equipment? What's the ventilation like in that building? Does the ventilation meet the standards of what the film office expects? So there's a lot more information. Your locations team, you're going to have to budget a lot more for. And locations themselves are probably going to be charging more because they themselves need to implement a lot. They might need to make physical adjustments to their location. So there's a lot going on from that regard.
Yeah, I think, ultimately what it comes down to, a big theme is that like it's all in the preparation, and like, we discussed yesterday, like what is a tell of whether a low budget film production or film or TV production will go smoothly or go poorly. And I think, at least what I gathered is that it's all in pre-production. In like, if you can get down to every nitty gritty detail of thinking how the worst case scenario, I think that's what I hear a lot in terms of physical production, is like, think of the worst case scenario, think of everything that could go wrong. And if you have a plan for that, like, the better off you'll be. And that can go even in writing your script, of having like, for each scene, there's 2 other scenes that you could pull out of your back pocket of like, well, if we can't do this in person, then what if we did this? And these are the types of flexibility that I feel like producers are looking for more than ever.
Yeah, and like you said, it's going to be the onus is going to be on creatives to wear even more hats than they have in the past. The directors that are going to be getting a lot of work over the next year are going to be directors that are very well versed in VFX and that do their own VFX.
That's a great point.
If you don't know how to do it, now would be a really, really good time to be doing it, because it's very likely that either your story is going to need it because you physically can't shoot what you need, and you need to have CGI or any other type of VFX in order to actually get the visuals that you need, or because there is less people on a film set, and because there's less time, and the actual look that you're going for, you might not be able to like get things. You might not get the design that you're looking for, and you might not get the lighting that you're looking for, and you might need to do some touch-ups in post. There's going to be a lot of fix it in post over the next year.
Which luckily next class in 15 minutes is about post, which we will be discussing.
Let's go to 1 or 2 questions just so we have time. This is from Anna. She says, will productions be building sets more than using locations for those indoor sets?
It's tough because building sets requires more pre-production time and more rigging time, and it also requires more people. So I think the answer is yes, because there are going to be, most of the freestanding sets are going to be booked out months and months in advance. So people are going to have no other choice than to build their own. But I think that the number that you build is going to be incredibly restricted. And so, not only the type of locations or sets that you have in general is going to be restricted. Some films, I think ideally a production might only want 3 or 4 locations in an entire movie that you're shooting in now. And so if in that case, then yes, you would probably see you building sets for all 3 or 4 of those rather than using freestanding or existing ones. But it's tough because that just, again, requires more time and more money,
10
which
more issues. Yeah.
which is just going to present more issues.
I have a question about animation because Anna also asked, is animation becoming more in demand? And you obviously, both of you said yes. Do you feel like the animation genre or the format is going to blend into horror and thriller, or do you think it's still going to be primarily in the comedy realm?
I definitely think I think it's gonna melt into everything, and I think it like especially lends itself to horror and thriller more than anything else in my opinion. You know, I think that it's harder to get an audience to identify with a drama narrative through animation than it would
Yeah.
say with horror, because you know, horror directors can really flex uh, their visuals and the type of creations and creatures and mood through animation than maybe necessarily than a drama narrative.
That's such a good question. And I mean, I have no real information to offer up to that, but just on, talking about it is something you really haven't seen much of before.
Yeah,
Like
we really haven't.
I'm
Well,
excited.
I think of horror, you know, the sheer number of video games that are horror and thriller, like in tone,
Yeah.
narrative.
And that's something like when I was at Blumhouse, we met with video game people a lot of like thinking about how we could turn such and such video game into a horror movie. So like, I wonder if we will see that in terms of video game creator collaboration in a way. I don't know, just
Yeah.
speculation.
Yeah, and the one thing that it seems like every studio or is really trying to get, they want the tough thing is they want content that uh, will take audiences want to escape. They want escapism right now.
I know. I
You want
thought
that.
about that with
You want to be able
horror.
to immerse yourself in a world that isn't ours because, yeah.
And our world is such a
Um,
horror
yeah.
shit show right now.
So when you are doing animation, that allows you to kind of access that a little bit easier, and especially from a a horror or a sci-fi perspective of being able to do a little bit of world building, definitely a little bit easier to be doing that through animation than necessarily live action.
So I have a silly
I-
question, but like I also I feel like maybe a few writers might have the same question. Is let's say if you have a script that wasn't written for animation
Mhm.
and it maybe kind of like pseudo could lend itself to animation or it could definitely not. Do you feel like the writer should just kind of say in their pitch it could also be animation? Should they start molding their pitches to make it seem more amenable to animation or CGI?
I would dive headfirst into it.
Oh wow, okay.
Because
Mhm.
those are the projects that can be made right now. They
Yeah.
they are filtering out what they are listening to, what kind of pitches they are listening to, because there's no, a lot of the pitches they're getting and the scripts they're getting and their stories, the decks are stories that just are not possible to be made. So if you can just pitch your story in a way where like this, I really think that can be made and presented as an animated story, that automatically is going to raise some eyebrows and make it way more appealing for them to listen to.
And just bouncing off of that, and like in your head you might be thinking like, if they want it as animation they would tell me, but like from being in development and like knowing the development execs at a few places, like the more flexible and easy you can make it seem to them in how, like making their life easier in terms of taking your project from the page to screen, the more that they are going to want to work with you. So like in terms of a pitch, in that's where having those different options for scenes, like if this scene is in person and being like, well, and there's two other ways we can do this, and like this can also be animated, like already jumping the gun and like before they can even bring it up, if you are in pitches, and bringing it up top of the pitch is I think, a great move that you could do in terms of like making it seem like you're going to be really easy to work with, because I think that is such a hesitation on the development exec side, is like, when it's such a risk already working with a first time filmmaker, but like if you can tell that the person is so knowledgeable and will make your life so easy, then it's like, that's where I've seen at Blumhouse especially, people be like, this person was amazing in the pitch, that it's going to be so easy working with them. So like, I think with Corona, there are new and interesting ways to be easy to work with, and that is in ways of like offering up animation and whatever else we, yeah.
That's really cool. I'm scared. This
I know.
hour has scared me more than the other hours.
I
don't know
will
if it's
bring
the
it back
backdrop.
to what I said at the first part, though, where I remain hopeful because this breeds creativity.
Yeah.
Focus on that.
Yeah, I totally get it. Okay, and then we talked about, well, I guess this is from another writer, but I feel like we covered it in more ways than one. How should we think differently when writing to make scripts friendlier to the new normal? But I feel like you two covered that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I
Chuck.
think it's how can I make this script more of a character study than plot driven, because those are the scripts that are going to be, again, easier to make than almost anything else right now.
I'm actually curious. Oh, sorry, Jenna, go.
I was just gonna say, it's like beating a dead horse at this point, because like I feel like the past two classes too, we focused on characters. So I'm hoping this is very helpful to people writing right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, don't forget about one thing that is also going to probably make a comeback within the next year is VR narratives. So that's also something to keep in mind as well with animation. That they started getting really popular within a couple of years, and I think the VR phase started to kind of dip out a little bit. And I would expect that to become a lot. There already is a lot more VR productions that are filming right now, because they don't require that many people, and it is a way of escaping a little bit, and plays into that as well. And you can get creative you can mix a little bit of live action and animation together a little bit that way.
And I'm curious, Nick, for you at your company, have you gotten more or less or the same amount of submissions?
Well, I work in production, so I'm not really across the board in terms of getting submissions in. But I think that it's basically been the same.
Okay.
I was going to bring up one thing with that, and I'm glad you did mention submissions. And with that, I think some people are going to have the inclination to move into like, oh, let me write a rom-com about two people being stuck quarantined together. And I know we've talked about the escapism around it, but like, I would avoid being too on the nose with things. Like, and again, we've talked about the beauty and subtleties and whatnot, but like, especially now, I think places are going to get a ton of, like, when I was working before this was even declared a pandemic, like February and March, I was reading only pandemic scripts, like pandemic after pandemic after pandemic. And I think where you're going to stand out is by taking a whole different route with it and leaning heavily into the escapism of it, because I think people are going to be so oversaturated with pandemic and corona themed submissions that anything that does stick out of that is already going to be on their radar.
Yeah, I will also just add that in terms of from a submission standpoint, the one thing that has definitely changed has been the number of finished films, both short and feature length and just pilots that have been submitted, because people are so desperate to acquire already produced content. So even, some shorts or some features, or, if you have anything on the back burner that you may have not had success selling in the past, people need content right now. So there's, people are finding, luck with selling some stuff that may have been in the closet for the last couple of years.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
That's such a good idea.
Even shorts, even, it doesn't matter what type of content, people just want it. So.
And you never know if that's going to be what does get your script in the door. Because me and Gabby and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where it's like when you're getting, so many submissions, and now places are strapped with bandwidth because, all the companies have fired everyone basically. If there is an option to watch a 5-minute short versus read a script, they're going to pick the short and then go to the script. So if there's any way to if there's any time to make something to have in your back pocket, I would say is now, if you have the resources.
It's such an interesting time for writers and different creatives to really think outside the box and really think of creative ways to be seen, be heard, kind of showcase themselves in a unique way, which I think is interesting. And I think, Jenny, you said this before, it's like this is going to breed creativity in ways we haven't seen before. So it'll be exciting to see. So cool. Well, I know we're going to jump into the next one at 2. So maybe we'll give Jenna like a 5-minute coffee break.
Sure.
And then what's your next colleague's name?
Collie.
Oh, he's great.
Yes.
Oh, good. Awesome.
I will add one. I'll add one good, hopeful note to end on.
Okay, good.
Yes,
thank you.
I will add one hopeful thing to end on.
Yeah.
Take it away, Nick.
People will be looking for stories and for scripts from people that they wouldn't be considering, like smaller voices, people with less experience in this time, because people just need stories that they're not going to only take them from top level tier writers or producers, because those people are so used to thinking big. So there's a really good opportunity now for writers to make themselves known, because people are looking everywhere. So now's the time.
Perfect.
That is a hopeful way to end. That's a really hopeful way to end.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Good luck.
Cool. So I'll just up the
Great.
All right. Cool. Yay. Nice to meet you.
All right. Well, I guess I'll take it away from here. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I'll give you a little introduction. So Collie is an assistant editor that bounces around between different projects. He's an in-house AE at Blumhouse. And he is a real jack of all trades, because previous to Blumhouse, he's working on low budget stuff now. And previous to that, he had worked on Kong Skull Island and The Fate of the Furious, which are like as opposite as you can get to Blumhouse movies. So he's got an interesting perspective on all things post. And it's funny enough, before we even got on this, on your section of the class, Nick was on, and he already dropped the fix it and post line. So we will talk about that a lot, because I know it's probably what you hate to hear. True or false?
I mean, it's not a great plan for people to have.
Yeah, it leaves a lot of problem solving, but creative problem solving for you guys. So I figured to start out, we could go over some concepts and terms, because post is full of technical concepts that not everyone might know of. So I think the first very common one that we'll talk about in particular a lot today, because it is a good workaround for things that arise in post, is ADR, which is automatic dialogue replacement. I've always only called it ADR, so that I learned something there.
It's not even automated or automatic. You have to, it's very much manual where you record it and select the right take and try and fit it into the actor's mouth
Yeah,
and mix it in. So I don't
that is
know.
misleading.
Yeah, I don't know. It should just be DR, dialogue replacement, but I don't know. I guess ADR has.
There's no changing it now.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about ADR and what it's used for, like both for adding in dialogue and for going over perhaps like things that have, bad quality in the sound when it comes back?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a tool that we use a lot in post that's relatively cheap compared to some other options. And I mean, basically, when you're in post, you're making the final draft of the screenplay. You're trying to clear up things and solve problems that may have not been foreseen during production or in the writing process. So the entire time we're in post-production, from even from the editor's cut to the director's cut, and once we're getting studio notes and preview notes and stuff like that, we're always thinking about ADR. And they have, if we're not able to get the actors or we're just trying stuff out, they'll have us in post do different voices for different characters in the movie, just recorded on our phones. But it's a good way, it's a cheap way to clarify things, to add lines of dialogue that aren't there, to clarify story points. And then, it's also used too in cases where the dialogue wasn't recorded as cleanly as it should be on set. So.
And we'll talk more about how ADR can be used, when story things don't make sense that you didn't anticipate, when we go over questions and how it all relates to contained and low budget films in specific.
Mm-hmm.
But just to go over a couple more terms that are just helpful to know in general and specific to this. So editor's assembly, which is also loose assembly, which is also rough cut. Do you want to talk a little bit about what all of those terms mean?
Yeah.
I think they all mean the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, those are pretty much the same term. I mean, I guess like how post works now is that they'll bring on the editorial crew and the post crew during pre-production and are talking with the director and set about dailies and how we're going to be getting all the footage and color space and VFX and all that type of stuff. As they're shooting, the editor and the assistant editors are logging the footage, checking the sound, making sure that things are in sync, things are being recorded clearly, and the editor is assembling the footage from each day of shooting so that, they can be the first to call out if things aren't working on set, or if, while the sets are still up and we still have the actors, like, okay, could you just grab a quick little insert shot of this? Because it's so much easier to do it than going back, a year later or 6 months later or whatever, after the movie's long been wrapped and stuff like that. So the entire time during shooting, the editor is cutting and trying to keep up with camera, though, depending on how many editors you have and how much footage you're shooting, it's difficult to keep up with camera. And then after shooting wraps, there's usually a week or two where the editor is, the director's recovering from all the craziness of set, and the editor's just by themselves assembling the movie into an assembly cut, which is everything. And it plays long, and there's often no music, no sound design, so it's a tough cut to watch because it's just everything in its rawest form. Not even, there's a little bit of trimming and stuff like that, but it's mostly just kind of thrown together, and it's watchable, but it's tough to watch, and it can be tough to watch. And then after that editor's assembly, it goes through about 10 weeks of director's cut, where the director and the editor are just sitting in a room for 12 hours a day, just kind of talking about, going through every scene of the movie and talking about things and cutting things out and reordering them. And then after that, it's shown to the studio, which is the studio cut. Studio will give notes, then we'll take it to a preview, get audience's feedback, and then after going through that process for a while, once everybody feels like it's in as good of a place it can be, then it gets locked.
And deliverables.
Mm-hmm.
so that
Yeah.
when it's locked,
Mm-hmm.
deliverables are sent to the distributor.
Yeah. So I mean, after it's locked, then it goes through a sound mix. So the sound designers will do their sound, and the colors will do their color, and we'll, you know, there's all these different formats that we have to deal with now, whether it's going to be, I mean, usually we make a DCP, which is the file that's going to be screened in the theater. But there's 4K projectors now that we need to do it. Sometimes we'll do an IMAX version of it. And there's also in the mix stage, there's all these different deliverables for, doing an IMAX mix and an Atmos mix, and then a stereo mix for a near field mix if you're watching on your phone or your laptop or computer, something like that. So after it gets locked in, it goes through all these different departments and creates all the different formats that we're going to need the final movie to be screened in.
And this is where I'm sure all the other creative brained people listening are like, what? It's so many different terms. Or is that just me? So I wanted to just briefly go over terms because I don't really know experience level of everyone, but just good to have those clearly defined. And there's so many technical post terms that I I can't even begin to fathom. But since you guys are all writers, we don't have to go too much into specifics on that stuff. So I figured we could just move into low budget specific post problems, issues, pros, cons, everything.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the hurdles that you would say you typically encounter be working in the low budget contained area versus the tentpole movies?
Yeah, I mean, the lack of resources is, I mean, you definitely see it in post. Like on Fate of the Furious, I think that was a $250 million budget movie, and we at times we had 3 or 4 editors who were all very well paid, top tier level editors, and then maybe 4 or 5 assistant editors, and we had 2 music editors, and we had an entire sound team with us cutting sound the whole time, and we had a whole VFX team of 2 VFX editors and 1 VFX assistant editor and coordinators and supervisors and stuff like that. And oftentimes,
so everything was very streamlined, it sounds like.
I mean, there was more division of work, yeah, and it's a little bit. There's definitely more people to help out, but it's also a much bigger movie, with lots of huge action sequences and so many more moving parts to manage. I mean, I think that movie had over 2,000 VFX shots, where in a Blumhouse movie, if we have 100 or 200, that's kind of a lot for a Blumhouse movie to have 200 VFX shots. For post in Blumhouse, it's 1 editor, 1 assistant editor. I'm floating around between all the movies that we have in post, sometimes 5, 6 movies, kind of being the second assistant editor and helping out with facility stuff like that. And then we have 2 PAs in house, but it just kind of when you have less money, you have a smaller crew, and then you have to do more things. Assistant editors on lower budget movies are responsible for things that maybe they wouldn't be on a big movie otherwise. They have to do sound design, they have to do temporary VFX, but it also frees you up. It gives you a little bit more creative freedom too, because there's less at stake, but also there's less people too, and so you can kind of try things. I mean, I've been able, editors have let me cut scenes on some of the movies here, and they'll give me feedback, and they'll show it to the director, and the director will give me feedback. So in this low budget environment, it's just it's a lot more loose and a little more free flowing. And that's what even the mixers and the colorists, we have a screening room in a theater at Blumhouse that we do temp mixes and color sessions in there. And even, the editors and directors, they say that, you do get, you're not going to get as big of a crew or as nice of a paid lunch and stuff like that, but you do get a lot more freedom and autonomy there.
Totally. There's less bandwidth for like studio execs coming to breathe down the director's neck.
Yeah, and generally the notes, it feels like a little bit more of a collaborative environment. At least the environment that they've made at Blumhouse between the executives and the directors and the editors and stuff like that. So it's not as stressful and scary when the studio executive is coming in to give notes. It's a little, they're usually happy to receive the notes, and it's collaborative.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will always stand by my opinion that post-production are my favorite group of humans, because everyone's just so much chiller.
It's fairly chiller, yeah. Especially, yeah.
So you talked about, ways in which that can translate to screen by, you get more creative freedom and you can take risks and try out a lot of different things. So in terms of like schedule, is there a difference in how you see schedule play out with like a movie like Fate of the Furious versus like a Blumhouse movie that might not have even a release date?
I mean, Fate of the Furious had a hard release date that we were working towards, and even though we had more time in post than most Blumhouse movies, it was, like I said before, there's a lot more VFX, there's a lot of different crazy sequences. So I was working a lot of 6-day weeks, a lot of 7-day weeks. I worked 30 days straight at one point, and just absolutely tired coming in on the weekends. We were staying up late, coming in early, and there were billboards for the movie being advertised everywhere, kind of just reminding you that, okay, you gotta, it's coming out still, so you gotta keep pushing for it. And I guess the different thing about Blumhouse movies is sometimes we have release dates that we're working towards, but other times it's not as, if there isn't a distributor for the movie already and there's not a release date set, I've seen movies that needed more time in post push their post weeks and add a third or even double it. And one of the nice things about working in low budget too is we don't have to work weekends, which is a lot better for my mental health. So it's a difference.
Truly, which I think, I mean, there's also the drastic difference between a movie like Fate of the Furious, where it has these like huge set pieces and like the story isn't as in depth and complicated as with low budget.
Letty like died and came back, and she came back as their Dom has this son that he doesn't know about. It's crazy. No, it's like a soap opera. It's crazy.
Yeah, truly. But like with low budget, it's like everything is in the story. So like,
absolutely, yeah.
The hesitation in setting a release date oftentimes is like you do hear you fix it in post and things like that, but it really is like you're almost rewriting in post, and you said that yesterday, where post is kind of back to the writing phase.
I mean, the writing phase and post-production are probably the most similar with each other, because it is editing the final version of the script. It's I mean, you're going through what was shot and figuring out what works and what doesn't work and how to make things better, or reordering things and stuff like that. So it is similar to writing, yeah.
And sometimes it means even like changing the entire story. I mean, this is another area where I think it's so essential to have that script in a ready to shoot phase when you're shooting, which sometimes when you're working with low budget isn't always an option, or isn't always forced to happen, because you're working with like these crazy deadlines. There's a lot that goes into it, but I know on the movies that I've worked on at Blumhouse, it was a common problem that like you'd get to that first cut and it was a lot of things weren't working, and it was a really great experience for me to see something go from like a story I thought it would be in the story we saw in the script to literally a completely different thing. So how often do you see that happen where it's like it starts as one thing and it evolves into a whole different beast?
I mean, I sometimes read the scripts that come into post, but I often don't. So I don't.
Well, as
don't
someone
know.
that does have to read the scripts or did,
But, yeah.
it happens.
Yeah. So no, I mean, I imagine it does. I mean, yeah, you know, you go, I mean, it like you said, it is definitely important to have the best possible material to work with. And that starts with the screenplay and the pre-production phase of that. I mean, I really have seen mostly movies change a lot only in post-production, where we watch the assembly that's long. You know, an example of that is The Invisible Man, which started out as a 3-hour assembly cut with every scene in it, you know, the entire length of the scene. And the writer was also the director, so he was spending a lot of time with his editor, kind of talking about what's repetitive, what they need, what they don't need, and ended up getting the movie to under 2 hours. But it is fascinating to see how much how much you can do with editing to take something that feels kind of like long and it's like, oh my gosh, is this the movie that we have? And once it's tightened up and cleaned up and polished, and you add visual effects and sound design and music to that, and it all just kind of works together perfectly, and you're like, oh my gosh, this feels like a movie now. This feels really good. So,
And you see that especially, I would say, as someone who, like, for me, coming into post, or not even coming into post, but like the last I would see of it was reading the final script and then watching the dailies, and then typically like the director's cut. And when I would watch that director's cut, it was like, oh, this is so different than like the dailies and the script that I read. Like the story can truly be so evolved at that point. And I think Invisible Man's a good example to talk about, only because it's already out and released. But you know, I think for Lee especially, Invisible Man was, to me, it felt like he finally came into his own in the editing room, and like you see it on screen, like everything, it hits such a rhythm that like you don't see with every film. And like Invisible Man's a perfect example of really feeling that rhythm working, and that was because I think a lot of the editing. And
absolutely, yeah, for
Invisible Man, they did reshoots on that one, and that's something we can talk about too, is Blumhouse is notorious for doing reshoots for, I mean, almost everything. And those decisions are made in the edit room when you reach a point where you're like, and a lot of times it is after a test preview where things are just still like not making sense. So I'm trying to think of what the specific scene was that was reshot for Invisible Man. It was,
well, we added the scare in the bedroom of the invisible feet walking toward Elizabeth Moss.
And you could see someone like sitting, an invisible body sitting in the chair, which that was a thing where like it wasn't necessarily super necessary for the story to make sense, but that was where Lee just saw an opportunity, because he's just like a master at scares. And
let me close my window.
Oh, you're good. He's getting his carpets cleaned, everyone. So with Lee specifically, I think is an example of a director, because I saw someone post a question about the most common mistakes you see directors making in the editing room. And if we're talking about the opposite of mistake, which is like a director that is so good in the editing room, I think Lee is that, where he just he's so detail oriented, and post oftentimes for him takes much longer than it would for another director, but he really like finds every little thing to fix, and you see it on screen. So versus if we want to talk a little bit about the common mistakes, I think we talked about a common mistake yesterday, which was like, it kind of yes, it starts with the script, but also when there aren't enough takes for an editor to choose from. Would you say that is one of the, like, what are the issues you see? I should frame it that way.
Issues first time directors. I mean,
or just mistakes in general that you see.
I mean, definitely if we're talking about, well, first thing is, you know, like we said, shooting a script that's not ready yet, because you can try your best with editing, but you can only work with the material that you're given. So the script should definitely be in the best place possible before even getting to shooting. And then you also, when you're shooting on set, it is beneficial as a director to think like an editor for how you're going to be shooting your scene, of what shots you're going to need to take, what coverage you're going to want, but also how many takes you should get, what types of different variations and direction you want to give to the actor, how much you want to let them experiment on set and stuff like that. And then, you know, when they're in the editing room, I think it's just really important to, after you've done as much as you can with the movie, so, you know, you get your 10 weeks of director's cut, to be able to show it to a lot of people and get lots of feedback from people that are close, that know you, and, you know, would be able to provide you with good feedback and have a filmmaking thinking mind so that they can give you specific things, but also just, you know, going through our preview process where we'll go out to Woodland Hills and recruit an audience of 200 to 300 people, just regular moviegoers, or the target demographic audience that we're trying to sell this movie to, and see what regular moviegoers think and see how they feel. So I think it's, especially in post, I mean, it's because for me, it's a little hard to read a screenplay and visualize it completely in my mind, you know? So I think the best way to show, you know, movies are meant to be seen, scripts are meant to be shot and seen. They're not supposed to read like a novel. So the movie is the easiest thing that you can show to people and get feedback on.
Totally. And it's so necessary because at that point 10 weeks, you're just seeing what you've already been entrenched in for probably the past year. So I think bringing up the test previews is a great point, because so much of the movie's success or lack thereof is determined, I think, by how many eyes you can get on your script and your movie and everything, and like how precious that director is about that. Like what I've seen a lot, and like I think test previews were my favorite thing about the experience of working at Blumhouse, just because it is fascinating to see like what people choose to harp on. And it's always things that like I feel like no one noticed because they're so entrenched in the story, and it's been the story that they've ate, slept, and breathed the past year. Absolutely. And so I think a director, writer, and like their ability to take that and work with it instead of, you know, being reaffirmed in their opinion about what they want to do with the movie, instead of doing that, being like, oh, well, let's basically rewrite. And that's where that writing, the whole saying of like post being like the writing process comes in, because after the test previews, a lot of times you'll get back and you, it's a combination of you pass out the questionnaire sheets and the focus group that you can go off of, but in looking at, I think the biggest question people look at is like what makes sense and what doesn't, and working off of that.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's kind of, I mean, that's also a big job of the editor too, you know, especially working with a director or a writer director who's just really close to the material, is that an editor's hopefully supposed to be able to, in a nurturing way, be able to figure out, you know, from a little bit more of a removed point of view as to what is best for the movie and what would make the movie work best. And if that means slowly trying to convince an editor or a director to lose a scene or a line of dialogue that they love so much, but people just don't think it works, you know, so that, I mean, yeah, that's part of it. It's
that's
just
such a good point of like the being a little removed from it, and like then very, very, very strategically planting the little seeds of like, well, perhaps if this scene was shortened and things like that, where you know the trigger points where you know a director is going to be precious about something. And it's so interesting to watch how a movie can really evolve from one thing to a whole different thing in like such a, I've seen it done well and poorly. I think I'm thinking of one example that hasn't come out yet, so we're not going to say the name, but just to kind of go over it without saying the name, like it's in the edit process right now. And we had talked yesterday about how since I've left that it's going through all these changes, that like the movie that I saw went right before leaving Blumhouse is so different than what it has become, and they're just trying all these experimental things, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had the editor and the director, they recorded a bunch of temp ADR, you know, they're just writing stuff and recording temp ADR lines on their phone and dropping them in, and we're taking entire characters out and replacing them or moving scenes around. So it, I mean, it is kind of like a little bit of a puzzle where you can try and figure out, okay, what if we take this out or move it around here? But because the movie didn't get a great preview score, but they want to try and work on it as much as possible, and we can't shoot right now, so they're just trying kind of crazy things and just kind of throwing it at the wall to see what sticks in terms of editing things out and reordering it and stuff like that. So it is fascinating to see what you can do by just, you know, with just editing it to try and fix a movie. Yeah,
which kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about in Nick's class, which was like the under crazy restrictions like we are under right now, sometimes like the most creativity can come out of that. And I think in this case especially, you're seeing that where it's like suddenly no one knows when things are going to theaters and when release dates will be certain. So it's like these are the times to like really get down and dirty and experiment with like the jigsawing of things. But again, that case specifically, it's like the jigsaw and puzzle aspect of the editing process is so much more extreme when the script isn't ready. And I feel like you can always tell looking back, like these are things that did not make sense going in, but like you just hoped that you can kind of pull it out of the actors, but doesn't always work out, which brings me to the question of, can editors fix bad acting? Not fix, but enhance.
I mean, an editor definitely plays a big part in crafting an actor's performance, because ideally, as an editor, you would be watching every single take of every line and kind of mentally logging what works and what doesn't work. And performances are often stitched together by different takes or with ADR and stuff like that. And there are actors that I've called out, you know, after we watch a movie, we'll talk about it with the editor afterwards. And sometimes they'll be like, hey, you guys want to come in and watch us and get some feedback? And sometimes I'll say, oh, this person did give a great performance. And the editor will take credit for it. They're like, that was me. Because when you're watching so much footage, so many different takes, and you're finding the little bits and pieces that work together and structuring it together. That plays a big part with it. So editing can definitely, and you know, the same goes in reverse too, where a bad editor could make an otherwise good performance look bad on screen if they mess up the rhythm of the takes, or there's weird pauses, or they pick the bad takes or something like that. There's a lot that can be done with it.
So much power lies in
Yeah.
the editor, truly.
Yes.
And I think another question before we turn to these questions from the audience. I know, so Blumhouse is a lot of notoriety, and not just in Blumhouse, just in low budget filmmaking in general, a lot of things that make call more attention to a low budget film is if it looks expensive and it was made for cheap. How much of that do you think is in post? Like what are some tricks and tools that you guys use to make something that might otherwise look cheap, look, you know, not like a $5 million movie?
Right. I mean, I feel like, you know, some of that happens in post, but I also feel like a lot of it is also pre-production and shooting and having a good DP and a good and coming up with cool locations and stuff like that. Because if it looks like, you know, if the DP is really bad and the camera and all the shots are super flat and it just looks uninteresting, I mean, there's a little bit that you can do with post-production and color and VFX and, you know, reframing and Avid and stuff like that, pushing in or adding some camera movement to make it look better. But it is, you know, the look and feel of a movie should be something that's determined in pre-production, and the director should be having that conversation with the departments in all the beginning. So they shouldn't be hoping to have a movie that was shot for low money and looks crappy and, you know, send it off to post and like, okay, you know, do your magic or whatever, because VFX is still expensive and you can only do so much with color to make a bad shot look good.
And so that's where the fix it in post line is questionable, because there is only so much you can fix in post. And I think that's where, at least with Blumhouse movies, we've run into problems, because so much of the time you get there and it's like, not everything can be fixed, and that's when reshoots a lot of times happen.
And reshoots are, I feel like reshoots are also could be a good thing. I mean, people should plan for it in their budget, because there are things that, you know, as you're writing the script and you're thinking about it in your head and you're on set and you feel like it's working and you put the movie together and you're trying all these different things. It's like, okay, it just this scene doesn't work the way I thought it would, or I need this extra little piece. So reshoots really can be one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself to make a movie better after it's in,
truly,
you know, after it's
especially with, like, I mean, the movies, I'm particularly thinking about Ma and Get Out, where those are two movies that would have been completely different movies had it not been for reshoots, because reshoots completely changed the ending in both cases. In both times, I think were from the test previews, where the feedback was so consistent and so unanimous that, like, they really didn't, not that they didn't have a choice, but it's like you can't get that kind of feedback and not do something with it. Absolutely. And I think in both cases, like especially with Get Out, I think is like the best example you can ever talk about with reshoots, where like the ending went from something that was so, I'm afraid to say on the nose, but where he ended up in jail and in the end, whereas there was such a beauty in the subtlety of the ending that they went with, I would say. And in terms of like really enhancing things in post, I think we're gonna see that change with Corona movies that are coming out, things shot during the next year or whatever, because there won't be as many locations and things are gonna look different. Have you guys, has that come down the pipeline at all to you yet? Like,
I mean, we're hearing different things about what shooting is going to be like.
we talked all about it
Yeah,
last one.
No crafty is going to be, that's going to suck for everybody.
I know.
But I mean, one of the things there, they keep, I mean, it's just going to be thinking about, like, they're trying to shoot movies that are more contained where you don't have to go on as many locations. Maybe you can just work on the Universal lot. And they're also talking too about either losing scenes with a lot of extras or trying to have to do VFX to get lots of extras in, which is going to be really expensive.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see what comes out of the next year or so.
So do you think there'll be more of a budget allocated for post because of things like that, where it's like, I feel like so much of the magic will be made in post now versus having more room to do things on set and, really do things on screen versus making magic happen in post,
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, either that or they're just going to have to hold off on shooting some ideas until, we can shoot them. But yeah, that's all things that they're going to have to think about going forward.
How has I know we didn't talk about this yesterday, but just to really make this relevant to the times, have you seen post change since going into quarantine and post COVID?
For us, our cutting room is shut down now, so everybody's working from home. So, we set up avids at editors' houses, and we've either had to make a lot of copies of backup drives, and we're not all on the same server, so everybody has to email or send files to each other, which is not as elegant as it used to be. Or, people are getting VPN set up where they can use the internet to remote into their system back at work. But so we've had to adjust to that. But I think the biggest thing is just not being able to get that face-to-face time with the director, because that's it's much harder to cut a movie without the director in the room, being able to just be there with them, looking for takes, trying things live and stuff like that. Right now, we do have streaming software where you can stream your Avid output to the director and watch it and video chat and stuff like that. And people are doing that. But oftentimes too, it's like, you'll get the director's notes and then you have to implement them yourself, even if you think they don't work. And then you export the cut, then you upload it, then they watch it on their own time, then they type you email back notes. So it's not as, it's just not as a great creative process.
Efficient.
Yeah, it's not as efficient as it used to be.
Yeah.
But, we're making do. Thankfully, people in post are still working. I'm happy that I've been able to work from home and still have a job and stuff. So, yeah.
And just so if people don't know, what's the name of that software where you can live stream at the editing process?
Evercast. Mm-hmm.
So for anyone that needed that. I like this question too. As a producer, she or he is wondering how they can best support their post crew. What's the best thing they can do for them?
It's a good question. I think bringing the editor on early in the process during pre-production to be able to, and also having a good, clear line of communication between the director or the script supervisor or the producer on set to spot those issues that are happening on set if the editor is seeing them. And then I guess in post, a lot of it is how notes are given and, realizing what the realistic timeframes are to, making sure that people have the proper amount of time to do things so that, we're not working 14 hours and then that leads to not as good work or more mistakes happening and stuff like that. Just, realizing if you're going to give notes and it's going to be a lot of notes, that they should come at 6 p.m. on a Friday or something like that. And also
Amen.
how, and also, how to give notes in a way that is nurturing to the director and not offensive and not, and in the best, in pursuit of the best place, or in pursuit of the best movie possible for people, you know, not doing things based off of ego or whatever, but looking at it from a perspective of how we can make the movie best.
Yeah, looking at it from a kind of foundational perspective. And bouncing off of that, like when you see notes given in a way that is constructive and helpful, what is there a general way to describe like the best kind of notes you see?
I don't know, you know. I mean, you definitely want, when you're giving notes, you want to make it seem like you know the movie and you know what you're talking about, and you're not giving a note just to give a note because that's your job and you need to think of something. Your notes should be coming from an educated place and a smart place. And I feel like if they're a genuine note, then the editor and the director will be more receptive to that and feel that. But at the same time too, how you give a note is really interesting. Like the one of the things I always think about, I went to a talk with one of the editors the editor from Whiplash, which was a Blumhouse movie. And he said that Jason Reitman was one of the producers and he watched an early cut of the film and he sat through the whole thing and had a meeting afterwards. So he sat through the whole movie and the lights came up and he told the editor and the director one note, which was J.K. Simmons is not scary enough. And then he left to go do something else, to go to his other meeting. And that was it. That's all they were left with.
Boy.
They were like, okay, so what do we do with that? So they told us during this talk that they cut out all of this stuff where J.K. Simmons, all this backstory from him where he goes home by himself, comes home to an empty apartment, puts on some jazz music, eats dinner by himself. You know, there's pictures of his previous family and all that stuff. So they cut out so much of his backstory to make him into this terrifying character. And he ended up, you know, it's a great movie and he won an Academy Award for it. So that's an example of a note that's not super detailed. It's just one sentence. J.K. Simmons is not scary enough.
That's such a good note now thinking about it, because he did turn into like such a I feel like taking out, I didn't know that apartment scene was a thing, but like that is essential because he's so not a human in that movie.
Exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was one of the best stories that I've heard about a note and stuff like that. And oftentimes from the studio, you know, we'll get this massive package with paragraphs and paragraphs and try different things like that. Sometimes they're good notes, sometimes they're bad notes. But I think, you know, just if you're going to give notes, then you should have a good idea of story and how to give notes to a filmmaker and what can improve that story and stuff like that. I mean, you know.
Yeah. I think when I think about it, I think there are two types of like really good notes. And one is in really paying attention to the characters and knowing when they are losing their like multi-dimension in terms of like when you're losing an ability to understand like why this story is being told now and why this character wants whatever he or she or they want so bad. And the other is more specific to horror and comedy, but I think the reason test previews are so essential, or whatever kind of screening in horror and comedy, is because so much of it is in an audience's reaction, and like that can change by just cutting out seconds. Like seconds will make a huge difference as to whether a scare works or a scare doesn't. Absolutely. And I mean, there could be a whole series of classes spent just on talking about the dynamic of what makes a scare work. It's just that is something that like I have learned so much about, but it is such a rhythm that is really hard to master. And that's where you see like with Invisible Man test previews, they were super interesting because you saw these very specific scares, like the paint can one or whatever it was, where Lee would master the scare just by like shaving off seconds or like doing something very small from the test previews, and it would make a huge difference. And that's really where there is such a power in the editing process.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which, speaking of test audiences, I don't know if you know the answer to this or what's been talked about, but will test audiences be virtual now, and how will test previews look?
I mean, we have done, I mean, I participated in a virtual preview for a movie, and then we also did a virtual preview for one of our movies where we recruited an audience that we were looking for, and we sent out a screener link, and then people just type on their computers and email, or fill out a survey afterwards. And it's similar.
So much better than a normal test preview.
But there is a difference too, though, to seeing it in a theater environment with everybody. Because I mean,
Yeah.
I did a test preview at home, and I wasn't interested in the movie, and so I was cleaning up the kitchen. I was watching it, and I was eating, and then washing the dishes, and kind of on my phone a little bit.
So true.
Whereas, if you're in a so I mean, yeah, that could be more painful for the audience if they're forced to stare at the screen with no distraction in a theater watching a bad movie. But also, I mean, you just get a different feel for the audience when you're in there. Like you can, when you're watching, especially like a horror or comedy or something like that, and you're in the theater, you can really, without even looking at the comment cards, you can get a sense of where the audience is at and how they're feeling, and knowing where they're getting bored or what's working and what's not working. So
yeah, that's a great thing to bring up in regards to test previews is that just in like sitting on the sidelines and watching an audience, you can tell the rhythm of things. So if you have an example that comes to mind, or like a vague example that you can talk about, has there been a time where like a director has come back and said like, you can just see it on the audience's faces or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, they often use, test screenings to gauge whether a scare works or a laugh works or something like that. And we also we set up a little night vision camera at the front of the theater that records the audience, and we get their reactions and see whether people are interested, if a jump scare worked, if people are laughing and stuff like that. But oftentimes the editor and the director and the producers and stuff, they're all scribbling notes throughout the whole thing, because you can just totally feel when an audience is engaged and when they're not.
And then does that mean like, whether it be more so restructuring, or like totally, like what does it take for someone to be like, we need to just completely take out this scene, would you say?
I mean, you get a feel for it as you're watching the movie, but people also, they fill out a comment card at the end saying, what's your favorite scene? What's your least favorite scene? And then how was the pacing of the film? Is there anything that can be improved? And they also do a focus group at the end where they have a discussion with 20 people, and they ask those same questions. So, that's part of it. That's why it's just important to get feedback from lots of people, because you'll get that from the producers, you get that from your friends and other trusted filmmakers, or your brain trust that you show the movie to, but also, test audiences can often be pretty brutal sometimes with their feedback and honest and stuff. Yeah. And they can give you the hard truth that maybe you didn't realize before of things that aren't working.
Yeah, it can be hard to watch. Every time, no matter how good the feedback is or not, I just feel so bad for the director.
Yeah.
No, even if the test score is like 90% or like a really high score, there are still people in that focus group that just rip it apart, no matter what.
Yeah, it's tough to be there. So thankfully, the director's just sitting in the back of the theater, kind of, cringing.
And they don't know that. The focus group doesn't know that. And it's like watching someone be slaughtered in front of your eyes, truly. I like this question too. What are your favorite genres to work in? My
favorite genres, I mean, I did not like horror movies before I came to Blumhouse. I didn't watch horror movies.
I still think that's so funny.
Now I like them though. Now I like them, and I appreciate this craft of the jump scare and all that stuff. But I think my favorite to work on, I do find myself enjoying comedy a lot more is just because I like watching, if it's good, you know, I like watching dailies and laughing if the actors do something funny and stuff like that. But I don't know. I mean, editing's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking of crafting jump scares, I just want to share one J.K. Simmons like story that I found super, super interesting.
Regards to, sorry, my AirPods died. It was in regards to The Conjuring, and it was when, so The Conjuring's ending was just like apparently not working. So James Wan had Lee Winnell, who works with James Wan a lot, come and take a look at the ending. And Lee is the master at any jump scare or how to make something scary. And his one note was like, you need a different ending. What if you added this like creature, this nun, whatever? And it was either on Conjuring 1 or 2, but they added the reshoot of The Nun. And then the movie The Nun came out based on Lee's very specific note, based on one note that was added in a reshoot to the movie. The whole Nun movie came out of that. And that is like, I think the best story about post-production that I've heard in terms of like just how much can be changed, and also like one note can really revolutionize a whole series of movies. That still floors me about his addition to the Conjuring series. So Lee. But I think we're almost out of time, so let's see if there are any other questions. I think we talked a little bit about how will post be affected in trying to handle COVID issues. Is there anything you can think of to add to that? Are things still kind of up in the air for that?
It's just, yeah, I guess it just really depends on, I mean, yeah, you just have to be, the movies that get greenlit to shoot are going to have to be seen in what we can work with now. And if a movie demands certain things and we can't do it in the way that we normally would be able to do it, then it's just going to have to probably wait, I would think, or
Right.
be written to something that we can do now. But yeah.
And I'm trying to see if there are other questions. Alex, do you have any?
Let me see. Let's see. Anna just popped one into the Q&A box. I'm not sure if we can answer this, but maybe we can think about it. Is post for animation totally different than post for live action?
Yeah, I mean, I've never worked in animation, but I have talked to people that have worked in animation, and I mean, I asked them like, what does an editor in animation do? Because it's not like you have all these different takes to choose and to pick and to edit and stuff like that. So I guess basically like their production process or what the editor does is that they are editing the storyboards together and the sound effects, and that's what they're editing, is the storyboards and the little drawings that they do together. And when they're animating, when they're shooting, they're only shooting what the editor has edited. So they're shooting a predefined template of, okay, we're gonna come up with a wide shot, then go to the reverse angles here and close up and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, it's completely different. Like post in animation is also production in animation, because they're creating the shots and shooting everything at the same time.
All right, cool. Yeah, I did not know that.
Crazy.
Sweet. And then you all might have talked on this earlier, but something that I always find interesting that I hear a lot from writers is how closely might a writer-director work with the editing team in the creation of the final product?
I guess it really depends. I mean, if it's a writer-director, then they're going to see it through the entire movie. If it's a writer that sold their screenplay, It really depends on whether they're a producer on the film or what type of relationship that they have with the director. You know, if it's a movie that the studio bought a long time ago from a writer and then, you know, gave it to a director and a director made a bunch of changes and stuff like that and they've never met, then the writer may never be invited into the cutting room. But if the writer is a producer on the film and has a good relationship with the director, you know, we'll send them cuts and we'll invite them to preview screenings and stuff like that, and they can provide feedback. And it's definitely beneficial to have the people that originated the idea and the story to be there to help fix any issues that have, you know, are there to write lines of dialogue or to try and reorder things or see what isn't working.
That's a great thing to note, especially for writers, just that it's, I think, a hard pill to swallow, that if you sell your script and you don't, like, that's something to think about so early on, that if you do want, you know, if you really want to have a say in things after you hand off that script, that's where negotiating your title will make such a difference. Because a lot of times, like you said, you see someone sell a script and then, like, that writer is never talked to again because it's the production company's property. So and you see all ranges of, like, you know, a lot of times they'll slap on the EP title, and that's a way for the writer to get a say in the final edit. But that's a great thing to know, just for first time writers or people that are looking to sell a script, that if that's something you want, then it is definitely something that you, from the start and from the get-go, really be juggling your leverage on how you can get that.
Absolutely. All right. Well, those were really my questions. I was mostly just sitting here going, oh my gosh, I'm learning so much and I love this.
That's great.
Post is such a world of, like, I could do a whole, like, lecture series just on post, because I don't know a lot. Like, I'd love to interview other people because it's just, there is so much to post.
Coming soon, lecture series on post-production.
Sounds great.
Oh man, but you know, really, the post crew are absolute wizards. On behalf of everybody else in the film industry, thank you.
Truly.
I'm happy to represent the entire post-production industry. And
You're doing a fabulous job.
Except your thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Well, all right, cool. I think that's about our time.
Great, thanks guys. This is fun.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Polly. You were very, very informative. I think we all learned a lot.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Jenna. Alrighty. See you.
All right. Thanks. Have a good one.
Bye.
Cool. All right. And that concludes our lecture series. Woo! We did it.
I hope it was educational.